What a joy to see you all. You have definitely exceeded our dreams. There might have been tears of joy. I want to begin with introducing or reintroducing. For some of you, it's introducing for the first time. For some of you, these names will be very familiar. But to at least familiarize you with 24 women in the visual record of Ravenna. And my goal is more devotional than anything else at this point, to remind us of the cloud of witnesses who have gone before us and to be inspired. So I took a student to this space over the winter, and when she walked in and saw this and saw all these women, overwhelming number of women, she wept. And then together, those of you who are with me in Italy, I want you to sing with me. We sang in this space, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." And they asked our choir to do a performance, and we had to say, no, that's all we do, is just that line. So don't want to create too much of an expectation. But just as a reminder that these are in worship spaces primarily. And so not only to recover the memory of these women, but to recover their memory in the context of Christian worship of the cloud of witnesses. So I want to begin with Galla Placia. And she's a 4th century into the 5th century Roman empress. She has had so many female roles as the daughter of an emperor, then a half-sister of 2 emperors, then the queen consort or wife of 2 more emperors, and then as the very powerful regent of a son who's an emperor. So she's basically the only one who survived for a very long time. And interestingly enough, the Smithsonian Magazine, just in their February issue of 23, did a feature on her when I was already working on this, so that was very fun. What they don't mention about this woman who ruled when the rest of the world was in chaos was that she was a patroness of religion, that she was using her influence to refurbish some churches that were in disrepair, because it was important to her as a devout person to honor some of these spaces. So she is a name that we want to remember, particularly as there are restorations in St. Paul outside the walls, and then in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Cross, Galla Placia. Next, I want to ask Christine Bleeker to come up for 2 minutes and talk to us about Theodora, because as we were traveling in these spaces, she's doing her presentation on Theodora, and rather than listen to me talk about somebody that I barely know, I'm going to let Christine talk for a couple minutes about who is this woman, Saint
Thank
Theodora.
you. I didn't know I was going to be first. Hello.
You're second.
Okay, second,
Yeah.
yes. Right, after Dr. Glahn. So Theodora was actually married to Emperor Justinian, and in the Basilica in Ravenna, her mosaic is actually right close to the Apse mosaic, where Jesus is conquering the universe. And it's directly opposite a similar mosaic of her husband, Justinian. So there's a lot of gender parity in the mosaics. So
That is parity, not parody.
yes,
Okay.
Parity. So anyway, she was an empress through marriage. She was born poor. Her father was a bear trainer, and she was actually an actress, but that's kind of code for child prostitute. So she was actually forced into prostitution with her sister. The allegations are that she had to have abortions, which were likely the result of rape. She ended up but she was very smart, and she ended up becoming a very devout member of a religious minority. Ended up meeting Justinian. He wasn't emperor yet. Because he was a senator, they were going to, like a country senator, they were not allowed to be married. So there were laws against political leaders marrying lower classes. So she actually convinced him, and then he convinced his uncle, who was the emperor at the time, to change the laws so that they could be married. When Justinian became emperor, she's the one that actually passed a lot of legislation protecting women, outlawing the death penalty for women who were accused of adultery, and protecting children from prostitution. So she's kind of one of the big leaders of women's rights, even back in the 6th century. Basically, the Justinian Code is all this legislation that was passed and is relied upon by Europe and South America. But what's interesting is that no legislation was passed, significant legislation was passed after she died. So he ruled for 17 more years after her death, but nothing more was passed. So she was kind of the real force behind his ruling. And I guess the last thing is that she convinced Justinian and his generals to stay and fight during uprisings in Constantinople, because they were the emperor and empress of the Byzantine Empire. And through their leadership, they actually re-expanded the empire, took back a lot of Italy.
St. Theodora. Number 3 is we're going to talk about the procession of 22 women. And so as you saw in that brief visual overview, when you walk in the space of this Santa Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, where these gorgeous mosaics. And the beautiful thing about mosaics is they can be 5th century, 6th century, and they look like they were installed yesterday because they're stone and they don't fade like a fresco will. And so not only do we have these gorgeous depictions of these women, you'll notice they're all depicted the same. They're all carrying crowns to the throne. In the case of the women on one side, and we'll get a better shot of the Magi later, but they are proceeding to Mary holding Jesus, and then they are matched on the other side by their brothers in the faith who are martyrs, who are proceeding to Christ on the throne. So proceeding to the Madonna and Child on one side, Christ on the throne on the other. And one of the things that we see in these early spaces is this gender parity of matching of men and women ministering together in the cloud of witnesses together. So here's where you can sort of see where the women are proceeding to Mary holding the baby Jesus, and you can see those wise men from the east. And we'll learn a little bit later that the 2 women at the front have an Eastern connection. And some of the art historians think that that is sort of a nudge toward orthodoxy, that we have the East and the West on this as we are fighting Arianism and winning and sort of recasting the art to choose people from the East and the West to say this is the faith. But anyway, the wise men, and there were wise men from the East. Okay, so proceeding to give their gifts on the throne. So this procession of women, there are 22 women, and as you can see in the art, they are named, thank God. Who are they? And so all of them are named, and only Agnes is unique in that you see that little lamb there? She's the only one that has any sort of symbol that marks out anything that's identifying. And it appears that there's just the idea is to equalize everyone. The point is not necessarily to have individuality here as much as the testimony of these. We are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, all of whom gave their lives to Christ. So here's how I will I've set this up visually. So I'll have the name as it appears above the image in Latin, SCA, Santa, and then how they spell, the V is a U to us, right? So Santa Eugenia or Santa Perpetua. Anything that I've written in red in that Latin is there are the 7 female martyrs that are named in the Roman Mass during the Eucharistic prayer, even in the present. And then I'll have the year the era, the century of their death, and then an anglicized version of their name, and then a little bit of narrative to talk about them. Now, a word about the narrative. My goal here is not to talk about the historicity of the Virgin stories. Sometimes they're quite fantastic. And my goal here is devotional. So it's going to be very much just trimmed down to some things we know or we think are probably verifiable. And that's a whole different discussion for a different time. What my goal is to tell the narratives of these forgotten women that were known well enough to the Ravenna Church that they memorialized them in the church worship space, in mosaics, named them, and remembered them and were inspired by their faith in these worship spaces. So the first one is Santa Eugenia, or Saint Eugenia. So she is in a rich family. She is the daughter of a Roman provincial governor, and she's taken a vow of celibacy, and so she does not want to wed the son of a consul. And then she gets a hold of some readings by the Apostle Paul, and so she wants to meet some Christ followers. She herself has not made a commitment. And when she meets these believers, she converts to Christianity, has her hair cut to look like a male because then she wants to enter a space where she can learn theology. And so she presents as Eugene to enter the monastery, and on the abbot's death, she is elected as the abbot. Well, a wealthy widow who is healed through the ministry of this person falls in love with Eugene and is rebuffed and claims that Eugene has committed adultery. Well, so all Eugenia has to do is reveal her body parts, and it is clear that that was not possible. And so, but kicked out of the monastery because you can't be an abbot if you're a woman. So she is reunited with her family, and in the process of all that, her parents are converted, and later on, she and her father are martyred for their faith. Her father is assassinated, Eugenia is beheaded. Not only is she represented on the right, I have her in the procession, but we also see her in the Archbishop's Chapel mosaics, again in a space where she is remembered as an important woman. How many of you had ever heard of Eugenia? Okay. Santa Savina, 311. She's born in Milan to a noble family. She is married, so most of these are virgins committed to celibacy, but she's married. Her husband soon dies, and she embraces her widowhood. And under Diocletian's reign, she is committed to serving the persecuted. And this is a very brave move. If you're going to the tombs of the martyrs, if you're washing the bodies of the martyrs, if you're collecting their bones, then you are guilty of being one of them. So this is a brave thing for her to do. And she is remembered because she did bury the martyrs, Neighbor and Felix, later sainted as Saint Neighbor and Felix, who are in her house. They find her praying at their tombs, and so they decapitate her for her faith, of whom the world is not worthy. Interestingly, Savina is sometimes misunderstood as Sabina. And some of you have been to the church of San Sabina. And to further complicate things, she's buried in the church of San Sabina. So Sabina and Savina are in the Sabina on the Aventine, which is a historic church that where also Dominique later founded the Dominican order, which has nothing to do with our topic. It's just of interest. All right. Santa Cristina, we don't know Christina's given name. She's called a little Christ after her conversion, so we will call her Christina. She's a daughter of a Roman governor on Lake Bolsena in the Tuscany region, actually has an island on the lake in this era, and there's a town on the island on the lake, and her father is the governor of this island. And when she refuses to be married because she's committed to Christ as a virgin, at age 11, she's shut in a tower, and dad sends 12 maids to pressure her to apostatize. They are not successful, so he orders her beaten and imprisoned. And as the story goes, 3 different things happen. She's visited by angels as she's thrown in the lake, tied to a millstone, and somehow escapes. She is placed over a fire and somehow escapes. Her head is shaved for refusing to sacrifice to a god. And finally, in a rage, her father dies of anger, apparently. But her successor then takes over where father left off, and he has her tongue cut out, put in a dungeon with snakes, bound to a tree, and finally the arrows take her life. She's a tenacious young woman. Now we have the sisters, Anatolia and Victoria, or Anatolia and Victoria. And I particularly love this story because I have a younger sister whom I dearly love, who is also a Christ follower. And I love that these two are memorialized together for partnering together for the faith. So they're sisters in a wealthy Roman family. Victoria is engaged to an unbeliever who says, hey, I want your sister to marry my friend. And instead, the sister persuades Victoria, don't you marry either. You commit to celibacy. So then the 2 men who are spurned are outraged, so they take these women to their remote villas and separate them and deprive them of food. And somehow over 3 years, they have influence and share their faith and see many people converted. And eventually, during the reign of Decius, both are martyred by the sword. Santa Paulina, number 8, the 4th century saint. So she's the daughter of Candida, and I mentioned Candida because Candida will also be martyred, and so she's a name of a female martyr we need to remember. Her father is a jailer named Artemius, and Paulina, the daughter, falls ill, and 2 incarcerated men who are believers under her father's guard, being a jailer, say, hey, if you will let us exercise, if you'll convert, we will exorcise her demon. So I don't know why they didn't just say we'll exorcise her demon as a ministry, but that's beside the point. If you'll convert, then we will do this. And he scoffed at them, but then she is miraculously healed. So dad believes, and then the whole family believes, and then the whole community believes. And as the story goes, 300 more believe, and they're all baptized. And then, of course, that many people can't be undercover, so the family is reported to the authorities. And reports vary about how they're martyred, but probably buried alive. And so St. Paulina, her remains were laid to rest in the Basilica of St. Pancras in Rome. So it's a pilgrimage site. Next we have Santa Emerantian. So she's a 2nd century saint. And the Roman martyrology describes her as a servant and foster sister of Agnes. And I have Agnes in red because of what I said about being read in the Roman Mass. She's included as one of those named in the Mass. The appendix of the Acts of St. Agnes say that while she is confronting pagans at Agnes's burial place, she's stoned to death. Now remember, if you're going to the tombs of the martyrs, if you're carrying the bones of the martyrs, if you're clean, you are guilty of associating with them. So they stone her to death while she's visiting Agnes's burial place, and she is sometimes depicted with stones. We have her here. There's a statue a statue of a chapel in France where she's depicted that way. Sometimes you'll see stones at her feet. Sometimes you'll see stones all over her body in the art, but usually connected with a stoning. Santa Daria, number 10. So she is betrothed against her will to a senator's son. Are you seeing a popular theme here? And Chrysanthus is the name of the person to whom she's engaged, and I name him also because he will become one of the martyrs. So this senator discovers his son believes and is committed to chastity, and he's not happy about it, so he sends women to tempt him and is unsuccessful. So he finds a young woman named Daria to marry him, not realizing Daria is a believer. So joke's on dad. The two are happy to marry and have a Christian marriage. They take a vow of chastity together. They share their faith together as a team. They see many converted, and so arrested, thrown in separate prisons, tortured, condemned, martyred by being buried alive, tossed in a pit covered with dirt and stones, of whom the world is not worthy. We also see Daria in that Archbishop's Chapel mosaics in that cloud of witnesses of women that we'll see. It is said that the tribune who ordered them to be buried alive, who ordered their execution, was so moved by their testimony that he and his wife and 2 sons also converted, and they were all martyred, and so all 6 of them who were part of this story share the same feast day as part of this story. Santa Anastasia. So she's a widow. She's one of the few who was married rather than confirmed virgin all her life. She's named in the Mass. So another daughter of a nobleman, and his wife is a secret Christian. So dad's not a believer, but mom is a believer. But then mom dies, and the priest who's been mentoring the daughter, Anastasia, is sent to prison. So since mom is gone now, mom's off the picture, the father orders that his daughter has to marry, and she does marry, but her expressions of resistance kind of outrage the groom. He's not excited about being this kind of resistance that he's receiving. So Anastasia disguises herself as a man, and with her maid goes in and is caring for the Christians, identifying with the Christians, and her husband finds out. And so he has her thrown in jail with 3 of her maids and threatens to have her starved. And the priest who's also in jail, who's mentored her, is encouraging her through writing. He's apparently able to get mail to her. And eventually her husband dies and Anastasia is released. And at this point, the story goes off in a bunch of different directions. But it's the reign of Diocletian. And it's said that the priest is released, she's released, so they travel Rome, sites around Italy, Macedonia, today's Albania, so they make quite the missionary trip. The priest is beheaded, and Anastasia is with other Christians forced into a sailing vessel full of holes. So basically the idea is put all the Christians on a ship, send them in the ocean with a boat full of holes, and they'll all drown. But the boat actually ends on Palmyra. And this is one of those, it's good news, it's bad news, it's good news, it's bad news. It's like, we're in the boat and we're going to die. No, we're safe, we're on the island. And we get to the island and they order the death of all those who won't recant. So all of them are burned alive. So Anastasia is part of the 270 martyrs that are burned alive on this island. Interestingly enough, in the Middle Ages, on Christmas Day, the Pope would go to 3 different churches to say Mass, and her church is one of the 3. The other 2 are St. Mary Maggiore, and then St. Peter's were the other 2 churches, but he would go to the Church of Anastasia, Mary Maggiore, St. Peter's to say Christmas Day Mass. It's one of the only 3 churches where he would do that. Santa Justina is connected with Padova. Usually people think of St. Anthony when they think of Padova, but Justina is living 303, 304, or dying in 303 or 4. So she's born in Padova, which is only about 200 miles from Ravenna. So some of these stories are very Italian and have sort of a local feeling to them. So she's born to a noble family. It is even said that her father was baptized by a disciple of Peter, so like 3rd generation of ministry. And after her father's death, the emperor orders Justina to apostatize. And she refuses, and so they kill her by a sword. And consequently, she is often depicted with the palm of martyrdom. And you'll notice these mosaics all these women have palms behind them because this is one of the symbols of the martyrs. And then, of course, that martyr's crown that they're going to take to throw at Jesus' feet. And also, sometimes she's depicted with a unicorn, which is, you'll see the Virgin Mary sometimes with a unicorn as a emblem of purity or virginity. And then sometimes she'll have a sword piercing her throat. So the Abbey of Santa Justina was founded in the 5th century. And one of the projects that we hope to see eventually in the version 5.0 of the Visual Museum is what are the churches that for 1,000 years have had the names of women on them? There are a whole lot of them. And, Santa this and that, Santa Thecla and Santa Reparata, all these names that, again, have fallen out of knowledge, particularly for those of us on this side of the pond, to sort of try to recover. So this is a large abbey that's still there, named for her in the 5th century. And this is a depiction of her in the St. Luke altarpiece, which you'll find in Milan. And I got a close-up here for you to see that she's holding that martyr's palm, which is, representative of martyrdom, but also you can see that sword plunged into her chest to represent the way that she died. Next, we have Santa Felicitas, also mentioned in the Mass, and she's going to die in 203. So this is North Africa. Story set in North Africa, and she is a servant of Perpetua, who we will see next, and they are often depicted together. Certainly in Ravenna, in 2 different places, we see them depicted together. So Felicitas is arrested for her faith and part of a group condemned to die. She doesn't want to die alone, but Roman law says we can't kill a pregnant woman, so they pray that she'll deliver early. And she does deliver early so that she can die with her friends. And also, sidebar, a Christian woman did raise the child. The child wasn't abandoned or anything, but per her wish, she got to die in the arena with her friends rather than all by herself a long time after they had died. And she is with Perpetua, so Felicitas, servant, Perpetua is of the noble class. She's educated and married. Her father objects to her conversion, but she converts, and he receives beatings for her conversion. You talk about pressuring somebody, right? We're not going to beat you. We're going to beat the innocent person who doesn't even want you to convert. But she remained strong and did not recant. And at 22, she is nursing while she's in prison. And she's keeping a diary talking about not only her visions, but about the terrible treatment that is happening to female in prison spaces that you could just fill your imagination in it. It's bad. So she is martyred with Felicitas, and she's also known as the first female Christian writer, early on, 203. Santa Vincentia is our unknown soldier. Some think that she is a martyr from Ravenna, which would sort of make sense. Others aren't so sure. And since we are here to talk about the forgotten faces, I think we will make her representative of the unnamed martyrs, the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, of whom the world was not worthy. Santa Valeria is another woman who's married. She's widowed. And she had married, later sainted, Vitalis. So this is a Ravenna story. Vitalis is in Ravenna. They have two children who are also later sainted, Gervanus and Protasius. And so Vitalis is actually from Milan, and he's served under Nero in the imperial army. So he's very high ranking, and he has concealed his identity in order to help Christians. And so he's helping some of the persecuted, and he gets caught, and so the authorities start torturing him, and he is martyred by being buried alive in Ravenna, but his wife at this point is still living. So she journeys from Ravenna to Milan, and as she's getting close to Milan in a local village, she runs into a big pagan festival that she doesn't participate in. And so she's then pressured to participate, and she refuses because she's a Christian. And so the villagers beat her to a pulp, and she survives for 2 days. She's carried to Milan, doesn't die immediately, but eventually dies of her wounds. Fast forward several centuries, Justinian, the emperor, who we heard about earlier with Theodora, builds a church in honor of Valeria's husband, known to us as the Basilica of San Vitale. That's who it's named after. And Vitale is the space that has Theodora and Justinian in the Mosaic record, even though they were never actually in Ravenna. And maybe an early indication of maybe some Christian nationalism showing up in the Mosaics. But anyway, Saint Crispina dies in 304. So she's another woman who's reared in a noble Christian family. And you notice this happens in the art and it happens in the written record. We typically hear first from the nobility because they have more access to ways of copying and scribes and having their stories told. For whatever reason, more of their stories have survived. So she's raised in a noble Christian family. She's married. Another one of our married martyrs. She gives birth, she's arrested and presented to the proconsul, and he orders her to have her head shaved and says she's going to die. And she says, I care nothing for this life. And kill me. I'm not going to recant, so she's beheaded. Augustine holds her up as, quote, a model for Christians. She could have lived a life of luxury and ease, but chose eternal glory. Is a rich young woman who chose that Jesus is worth dying for rather than things are worth living for. Santa Lucia, St. Lucy of Syracuse, Sicily. She's born to a noble family. She gets sick, and her mother says, to help with the healing, let's take you on a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Agatha to pray for your health. And while Lucy is at this tomb, she has a vision in which Agatha says Lucy's mother is going to be healed and Lucy is going to be consecrated to virginity. Lucy's mother is ill and takes her to the tomb, and they're praying. But the prediction is that Lucy will be a consecrated virgin her whole life. So Lucy sells her belongings and gives to the poor, and after 3 years, she's arrested and brought before a judge who says, you have to sacrifice to idols. And guess what she says? So apparently she plucks out, two versions. Either she plucks out her own eyes to avoid marriage because people didn't really want to marry a girl who'd taken her eyes out, or under Diocletian, she's martyred by a sword through the neck. And so she's often depicted as a blind girl carrying her eyes on a plate or with a sword through her neck. Now, I gave you a close-up. Apparently, the Uffizi says her eyes are on this plate. I have not been able to identify where they are, if they're there. But we'll take the Uffizi's word for it. I'm pretty sure they verified it. When I was and I'm sorry the picture quality is so bad. This was long before we dreamed of this, and it was long before cell phones had good photography in them. I was standing in the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, pre-Reformation 500 years. So I was on a press junket in a year in advance of the 500th anniversary with the government saying, here are some sites Christians might want to make pilgrimages to. And I noticed this relief of these holy 9 women on the walls of the church. And some of them I recognized. I recognized Catherine of the Wheel, but there were others I didn't. And I said, would this have been here when Luther was here? And they said, most probably. These would have been names that were very familiar to him. We don't know how old it is. It was brought over from a Franciscan monastery in the early 1500s. But in it, Lucia holds a palm branch, or the branch of victory. And again, it's kind of hard to see it. It almost looks like a squarish fan, but she is holding that branch of victory because she's a martyr. Santa Cecilia, 177-ish, is when we think that she was martyred. She is born to nobility in Rome, in a Christian family in Rome. She's taking a very early vow of chastity in her youth, and her parents betrothed her to a young man named Valerian. And when told of her faith, he's like, I believe too. Some records say that on their wedding day, he was baptized. So he and his brother, Tiberius, start burying the saints, and this is not going to go well, right? If they're taking care of the martyrs that are slain by the city prefect, of course, then they are suspect. And so the brothers are beheaded. So Cecilia is sharing the gospel with many as part of their testimony, and she is arrested, escapes flames, but then is martyred by beheading. And as the story goes, it took 3 different attempts over 3 different times to kill her. She is also depicted in the Archbishop's Chapel. And sometimes, so you can see the gash in her neck as it's depicted in art, but what we sometimes miss is the way she's holding her fingers. And it is said that when her body was, her bones were uncovered, that she was making the sign of orthodoxy, the dual nature of Christ and the Trinity, which would be sort of like, you can try to cut my head off, but... Okay. I will not recant. So Artemisia Gentileschi, this is a little bit amusing to me. I have seen art much later of her sitting at an organ, because she did play an organ, but early organs didn't look like our organs with keyboards, okay? But people read in the histories that she played the organ, and so we have her in the early centuries of the church sitting down and playing an organ. Interestingly enough, when they went to refurbish this painting in 1988, they discovered the organ in the background. It had been hidden before. But anyway, the reason that she's often depicted with music it was reported that she could hear heavenly music as she's being martyred, and that she invented the hand organ. And so from the 14th century on, she is seen sometimes holding a roll of music, sometimes at the organ, or holding a hand organ. Santa Eulalia. This is 3rd century saint. Again, born to a noble family, this time clear out in Spain, Merida, Spain. So at 12, approximate marital age, she's refusing to marry, and so her parents are sympathetic. So they hide her in their country home, but she doesn't want to be protected. She slips out so that she can testify. And so she goes to the tribunal and declares herself to be Christ's. And the judge calls for the hangman to torture her, and she sings praises and is burned with torches, to her parents' horror. This is teenage rebellion, 3rd century version. But there is a huge element of agency here that is worth stopping. Not to be confused with purity culture. Saint Agnes, again, Roman Mass still acknowledges Agnes, who has the little lamb there. So she's a noble class, dying in 304. In her childhood, she's committing herself to God and committing herself to virginity. She hits puberty, time to marry, and all these suitors show up because apparently she's very beautiful, and all of them are trying to change her mind, get her to marry them. And the chief suitor is outraged that he is refused, so he incites a judge against her, and at age 12 or 13, she is killed by the sword. Agnus, or agne in Greek, means pure or chaste, and Latin for lamb is agnus, which is why. I have a colleague at the seminary whose name is Todd Agnew, and so his Twitter is like Agnew's Day. He's like, it's just too bad nobody knows what I'm saying, Lamb of God. But anyway, she's often depicted with a lamb, sometimes has a sword, sometimes has flames at her feet, and even sometimes she is covered with long hair or a long robe, because in one of the tellings, she is sent to a brothel and she's stripped naked and quickly provided with either a heavenly robe or heavenly hair that covers her body. It seems like maybe a conflation of Mary of Egypt and Mary Magdalene and all the long hair. But anyway, she is the only Mosaic here in the Ravenna procession who appears with that unique symbol. Ambrose in 397 wrote a hymn to Agnes, and I just want to read a few lines as they've been translated into English. Now, when he wrote these lines, he did not rhyme them. He matched the meter, but the translator in English did rhyme them. So, courageous underneath the blows, her death a further witness shows, she took care of her modesty. For as she falls, she bends her knee and wraps her robes in modesty. O virgin born, all praises be to you throughout eternity, and unto everlasting days to Father and the Spirit praise. So in earlier years, the church knew these stories. Protestants in particular did not know these stories because as part of the Reformation, we said, hey, every saint is a holy one, which is true. But then we threw out the narratives that had gone with the reminder days. And so part of looking at the church year is looking at whose saint's day is a narrative that we want to recover. Again, you often see Agnes with a lamb, although in the San Zeno Chapel in Santa Prassede, she doesn't have any particular marking other than, thank God, her name is actually written in the mosaic, so we know who the mosaic layers are trying to depict. Saint Agatha dies 250, 251-ish. She's born in Sicily to noble parents. And a Roman official proposes to her, and she clings to her virginity. So he has her sent to a brothel to be violated, and then has her breasts attacked with pincers and burned and cut off. And she's martyred by being thrown into the fire and burned alive, but often depicted in art having her breasts cut off. So sometimes she's holding a branch of victory with a dish bearing her two breasts. In the Middle Ages, people thought she was carrying bread, and so a rite of blessing bread on her feast day arose out of a misunderstanding of what people were seeing in the art. But it's her breasts on a plate. And in that Wittenberg Castle Church, she is pointing to her breast as the part of how she was tortured before she was martyred, of whom the world is not worthy. St. Lucy is said to have made her vow of chastity after making the pilgrimage to Agatha's grave, right? Now we can connect those two stories. She's at the grave of Agatha when she makes her vow. Santa Pelagia takes her own life rather than surrender her virginity. So St. Lucian is said to have discipled her in Antioch. So our last couple of people are going to have a very Eastern connection. So she's in Antioch and born under Diocletian, which should give us shivers, right? You know what's going to happen to a young virgin under Diocletian. And so when she's 15, soldiers arrest her. She says a prayer and jumps from a high place into the sea. And the patristic sources treat this as a martyrdom rather than a suicide, because the suicide is intended to protect what she has vowed to Christ. Santa Euphemia is the mosaic that's actually closest to the Madonna and the Christ in the procession. So remember, as I'm showing you the people that are the furthest to the east in that procession in Ravenna, she is Chalcedonian. So during the Diocletian persecutions, she is born to a senator in Chalcedon, and she wears black to evidence that she has renounced the world. When she turns 15, the judge orders her to recant. Anybody want to guess how that goes? So she's refusing and is tormented. And in one telling, the soldiers try to break her body on a wheel, and it broke. So they throw her to the beasts, and they ignore her. And finally, she is said to have been martyred by being struck in the mouth with a hammer. Hammers to the face eventually take her life. Euphemia is also depicted in the mosaics in the Archbishop's Chapel. So you have some very prominent stories that are showing up in Ravenna's mosaic record, both in the San Apollinary procession and then over in the Archbishop's Chapel, you see some of them repeated. And just to take another look at, as these women are proceeding on one side of the church, all these martyr stories, their names are above them, they are carrying their crowns, ready to throw at Christ's feet. You have the palms that are representative of their martyrdom, their willingness to give their lives for Christ. And on the right, then, you have their brothers who are also proceeding, led by Martin of Tours, and the women are proceeding to the Madonna, and the men are proceeding to Christ on the throne. And that beautiful parity of men and women's stories that we so often are seeing in some of this early art is that it's not the women, it's that we're recapturing the women because they've been so forgotten, but it wasn't just women and it wasn't just men, it was men and women made in the image of God partnering together to support each other in the faith. I want to end by having us read this together. I began by saying that my goal here was devotional. And lots of scholarship needs to be done. There are books on pretty much every one of these women, and that will contradict things that I said, okay? This is one version of the story, and I have some sources here I can appeal to. But that is not the point, right? The point that I want to make is we need to be familiar with these stories. And because they inspire us, because they are the cloud of witnesses, because they are our foremothers in the faith. We had a student at the school where I teach who came from a closed country. And he said, I've noticed, I should back up. He had just lost 2 of his friends to beheadings. They were trying to run a Christian bookstore, and it didn't go well. And he said, I've noticed that you all, when you go to present the gospel, say, God has a wonderful plan for your life. We say, Jesus is worth dying for. So what we have just seen is 34 women, girls and women, who have said with their lives, Jesus is worth dying for. He is worth dying for. So I want you to join me in reading. When Paul laid out a list of saints and their incredible stories, this is how he ended it. Read with me. Therefore, seeing that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us cast off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners against himself, that we might not grow weary and lose heart. So I want to end by reading a prayer from Catherine of Siena. So I would ask you to pray with me. O eternal God, O eternal Trinity, through the union of your divine nature, you have made so precious the blood of your only begotten Son. O eternal Trinity, you are as deep a mystery as the sea, in whom the more we seek, the more we find. The more we find, the more we seek. For even immersed in the depths of our souls, we are never satisfied, always famished, hungering for you, eternal Trinity, wishing and desiring to see you, the true light. You are the highest good, a good above all good, a fortunate good, an incomprehensible good, an unmeasurable good, a beauty above all beauty, a wisdom above all wisdom. For you are wisdom itself, the food of angels, the fire of love that you give to humanity. Amen.